Okay, I think we're good to roll, Logan.
Yeah, I think so. So, hi everybody. Thanks very much for joining today. We are going to chat about Azure B2B and guest management best practices. Myself, I'm Logan Guest. I'm our sales and marketing manager at Extranet User Manager. So I get to work with lots of different clients and different partners on different portal solutions. And a lot of that nowadays is leveraging Azure B2B. Just a reminder, so just some Teams meeting etiquette. This is a regular Teams meeting. Feel free to chat throughout the webinar. You can ask questions. Our team's waiting. And I know Peter likes to have more open dialogues. If you have questions, feel free to jump in. If you don't mind, please stay on mute. If you'd like to actually join in the conversation, just ask on chat and we can invite you in. And most importantly, enjoy the content and hopefully you'll learn a thing or two. Just for some quick background from a product and company perspective, the big items here, 2014, we started supporting Microsoft 365 and Office 365. The challenge then was whether you were internal or external, you needed to be a licensed user. And that's why this Azure B2B functionality, which is a lot about what we're talking today, is so important because it allows you to bring guest users into your tenant without licensing them, yourself. Since then, we've continually evolved with where Microsoft has gone, and then with our latest version of our product, we've gone all in on this Azure Active Directory B2B story. So, from a client's perspective, very fortunate to work with lots of clients globally, all different industry sectors, building these sorts of client portals, member portals. They can take a lot of different shapes. What I'll do now is I'll hand it over to Peter and he can run the show.
Awesome. Thanks, Logan. So I'm Peter Carson, President of Extranet User Manager, also in Office Apps and Services, Microsoft MVP, and running the local Toronto SharePoint user group. We're going to be sharing a copy of the deck as well as the recording, so both Logan and myself's contact information will be in there. Feel free to reach out from any questions you may have following the session. So we've done the intro side of things. We're going to start with just a brief overview of Azure AD B2B, what it is, what it means, talk about licensing and some changes that happened on that side there. We're going to spend the bulk of the time on best practices for secure guest management. So we're going to get right into the Azure portal, talk about the different features that Microsoft provides. There's actually a lot there that we're going to be covering off, and we've been busy writing articles. We'll reference those articles. So you've got lots of resources to refer to coming out of the session. And then we're also about to launch an open source tool called our Power BI Azure AD Harvester. And basically what it does is it draws information out of your Azure AD into an Azure storage account. And then there's a Power BI dashboard I'll show you that lets you navigate through that, look for common issues, understand how people are using Azure AD and how you can support your guest users. As Logan mentioned, feel free to ask questions as we go through the chat. Logan and others from the Extranet User Manager team are going to be watching the chat, and we'll look to address those as we go through. If there's any we miss or we run out of time on, we can certainly follow up back with you from there as well. So it may be that a lot of the audience here is already familiar with B2B, but I think it's good to level set and talk about what it is. I mean, the B2B part stands for business to business. It's a bit of a misnomer, actually. There's two external Azure Active Directory offerings from Microsoft, B2B and B2C, business to business and business to consumer. The reality is you can use either for either scenario. You could use B2C, which is named for consumer for business, and you could use B2B, which is named for business for consumer, either way from that point of view. We're not going to get into it today, but we actually just recently published an article that compared B2C to B2B and why you might want to use one versus the other. We're a fan of B2B because it gives you that external guest access into Microsoft 365 and then the lack of a need for licensing for those guest users. You can't do that with B2C. It's absolutely part of B2B. So for things like SharePoint, Teams, Planner, even Office Online, so if the people that you're collaborating with that are external to your organization, need to co-author a Word document or an Excel or a PowerPoint, they can do that and they don't even need a license themselves as part of that. That's all covered underneath the Microsoft 365 guest licensing. There are other tools like the Power Platform, for example, Power BI, Power Apps, where the guest users do need licensing. It gets a little bit tricky. All things Microsoft tend to get tricky from a licensing point of view, but you'll have to sort of dig in and understand the different options there in terms of licensing your guest users from that perspective. But the big thing is, if you're sticking with the Microsoft 365 side, or if you're coming into your own custom application or third-party SaaS application, you can invite as many external users as you like. There's no limits on that. There's no cost to that. It's very cost-effective from that perspective. Now, you do need to be careful in terms of what Microsoft defines an external user as. So, some are obvious. If you're building a vendor portal or a customer portal, I mean, those folks are by definition external to your organization. Where it gets a little fuzzier is where you get into subsidiary companies or staff that are not maybe full-time office employees. Maybe they're field staff, retail staff, construction staff that you don't need to get them a mailbox, you don't license them, you can't use external access for those users. It does violate the commercial licensing terms for Microsoft. I mean, there's no hard stop on it in Azure AD because it doesn't know whether those people fall into that category or not, but you're setting yourself up for a big liability from a Microsoft audit point of view and a compliance point of view. So things like subsidiaries and franchisee and non-office staff are ones that we often get asked, hey, can we bring those under external users? No, if you want those folks to come into Microsoft 365, you should probably consider something like the 365 F1 license, which is a very cost-effective, I think it's about $3 a month per user. Doesn't even give them a mailbox, it just gives them Teams and SharePoint access, which honestly these days I think is more than sufficient for a user who's not in 365 all the time, that just needs to get employee communications and be able to interact and such from that point of view. Now, if it is a subsidiary or a franchisee, if they're licensed in their tenant, then they're fine to come in as an external user into your tenant as well, because they only need to be licensed once and their home tenant covers them from that point of view. So as I mentioned, it can get a little confusing and a little gray. Happy to dig into scenarios with you, but honestly, you probably need to engage with your Microsoft rep, and they'd probably bring in a licensing specialist either from Microsoft or from the cloud solution provider to kind of go through those details with you. So once we've got the external users and they want to sign in, so one thing first and foremost is often when you sign up for portals, if you go into some portal for an external organization that you're working with, they often ask you to create an account and to create a password as part of that. With Azure AD B2B, if it's properly configured, and we'll talk about that in a minute, there should be no password management for the guests. They either use their own credentials for their own organization, or they use what's called a one-time passcode or federation. We'll dive into that a little bit in terms of what that is. Now, from a technical point of view, Azure Active Directory is what's called an OpenID Connect identity provider, and that's an industry standard, across vendors. So you can actually use Azure AD to authenticate to other systems. If you want to provide single sign-on into Salesforce, into Desire to Learn, we've done a lot of those sorts of integrations into other vendor systems, as well as your own custom applications. And if you don't support the full OpenID Connect, it supports OAuth 2.0, SAML 2.0. Actually, it supports WS Federation now, which is an older standard that's used by SharePoint on-premises. We're actually looking at allowing guests to sign in with Azure AD and then access a legacy SharePoint on-premises infrastructure. So there's, really any client application that's modern from an authentication point of view can federate with Azure AD and provide single sign-on. And once they've signed in to their tenant, which gives them guest access into your tenant if you're inviting them in, they don't need to authenticate again. So it is true single sign-on from that point of view. So they may be working in their own corporate SharePoint Online portal. Maybe they're in their webmail through Exchange Online and Microsoft 365, and they come to your portal. They don't actually need to re-authenticate. They're just straight in from there. Unless they look carefully, they won't even notice the authentication happen as part of that. So let's talk about the different sign-in experiences depending on the guest. And you can't predict, well, to a certain degree you can, but it's difficult to predict exactly what experience each user that you invite is going to have. The simplest is the one on the left here, where they use Azure Active Directory in their organization, and typically that would mean that they're using Microsoft 365 within their organization. So they already have an account, they have credentials that are managed by their org. And like I said, it's a seamless login. They use their own organizational credentials. They're not being asked to remember a password or do anything special on your system as part of that. So that's kind of the ideal. When you're collaborating with other folks that are using Microsoft 365, it's super easy for them to come in. Now, it's actually the same experience if they're coming in with a Microsoft account. Maybe they have a Outlook.com or Hotmail personal address, and this is where I said, B2B and B2C, business and consumer, the lines kind of blur. This can be a personal-facing portal, but you want consumers perhaps to come into your Microsoft 365. So they could use their personal Microsoft account to do that. Now, if they don't fall into one of those two buckets, typically it defaults from there into what's called an email one-time passcode. And this is a new feature that's kind of been lighting up over the last couple of years. Microsoft was going to force it out onto all tenants a while back. They pushed those dates out. July 2022 is sort of the current date that they're pushing people towards for that. And we encourage you to turn this on right now in your tenant if you don't already have it on. And I'll go through where you do that and what that means. And basically the experience is, when I come in with my email address, since I don't have a Microsoft identity, Microsoft will then email me what's called a one-time passcode. It's valid for 30 minutes. I copy that 8-digit passcode, I type it into the box just like a password, and I'm in and away I go. That does two things. It makes it simple for them because they're not trying to remember a set of credentials for your system. And it also validates that they still have access to that email. One of the challenges with a lot of extranet or guest scenarios is you don't know when the people that you invited in no longer work for the organization that you invited them in under. So in that first scenario, the Azure AD, if they have an organizational account and they leave that organization, the first thing that organization is going to do is shut down their account, which means they've been shut down for accessing your portal as well, which is actually a good thing. You don't want people that no longer work for that organization still being able to come in. If it's an email one-time passcode, the same thing actually happens because they don't have access to that organizational email. They can't get the one-time passcode. They can't come in through there. Now, going more onto the consumer side as well, here again, you can set up Google and Facebook federation if you want to. So what that means is if you configure the federation to Google, somebody can come in with a gmail.com email address, typically a personal email, and use their Google identity. So they would use their password for Google, just like the Microsoft credentials on the far left there. Caveat there is it has to be an actual @gmail.com email account. If it's a business that's using G Suite and they've registered their own domain, so they use their company email domain, but it's being managed by Google, unfortunately, Microsoft can't tell that. They can't ask Google that. So they assume that this is more of a one-time passcode type of scenario, which is fine. They'll go down that path. And then Facebook, you can actually set up direct federation there, so people can click the I want to sign in with Facebook, and it'll authenticate in the browser in Facebook, and then they're into your portal from there. The last one we don't see too often. It is something to be aware of, and it's where you set up a custom federation in your Azure Active Directory. So if it's your guest that you're inviting in that's done that, what'll happen is when they go to their login, it'll redirect to their identity provider, and they log in through that. So it might be an Okta or some other third-party vendor that's doing identity management for them. That's a typical scenario where we see that. Where it's more challenging is if your organization is doing this and you're the one that's inviting people in, when those guests come in, they may by default get redirected to your identity provider, like your Okta login page, and that's going to be confusing for them. So you're going to have to work with your identity provider that you've set up to provide them a path to get back to the Microsoft login so they can go through that path, because they're not going to be able to log in through your custom login. So just be aware of that if you've got that set up in your tenant. It just adds a little bit of complexity to it from that perspective. Okay. Now let's talk about Azure Active Directory Premium. So when you set up Microsoft 365, you get what's called an Azure AD free tenant, and you can have as many members within your organization set up in that with no cost. You can invite in as many guests as you want for no cost from there. But if you want to add additional security to that, we typically recommend the client set up what's called Azure AD Premium Plan 1 for all of their staff. It gives things like proper MFA. I mean, there is MFA on the free. It's just not very configurable, and you can't customize it too well from that point of view. Conditional access policies are a feature of Azure AD P1. They give a lot more security around there. And then you've got other things like password protection and security and usage reports and such around that as well. So it's $6 US per user per month if you need to buy it as a standalone. Depending on how you package up your Microsoft 365, like let's say you've got a an M365 E3 suite for your staff, that actually includes Azure AD Premium P1 as part of that. Or maybe you've got the EMS, the Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite, that also includes P1. So there's lots of ways that Microsoft bundles and packages. Again, back to my earlier comment, talk to your account rep. We can help you through these scenarios if you're confused, because Microsoft makes it very confusing on the licensing side. You can also get what's called a premium P2. It covers everything that's in P1, and it adds in some additional things around identity protection, where it's actually looking for risky behavior and attack vectors, not just in your tenant, but across all tenants. And if they see that behavior in your tenant, they'll actually start logging accounts and doing preventative measures. Privileged identity management, access reviews. So there's a number of features of interest in there. But as a minimum, I would say look at having Azure AD Premium P1 for all of your staff. Now for your external users, basically your external users, the first 50,000 monthly active users get whatever your staff have. So if your staff have a premium P1 plan, as long as you don't have more than 50,000 monthly active external users, which is a really big number, they get the P1 features as part of that as well. If your staff have P2, they would get the P2 features from that. Now, it's a little gray, but my understanding is that you would only need to purchase a single P1 license for one of your staff members, and that would cover all of your guests from a P1 point of view. It wouldn't give you P1 features for the rest of your staff. I wouldn't strongly recommend that. I'd still recommend P1 for all of your staff, but if you're looking to save some money, that's another option to consider through there. So yes, all of the security protection that we're talking about here on the P1 and the P2 apply to the guest users as well. So things like conditional access policies that we're going to be digging a lot into can then be used on the guest side as well. Now, even if you go above the 50,000 monthly active users, you can see there, for P1, it's 0.4% per month per active user. It's still a very tiny number in there. You add another, 1,000 users from a guest point of view, that costs you $4 a month for those 1,000 users. Okay, so let's get right into the configuration of Azure AD B2B. That's sort of the meat of the talk that we're going to be giving here. So these are a number of different spots you should go to in your Azure portal. Now the assumption is you're probably going to need to be a global admin to have a look at these things. So if that's not you, by all means, listen, learn, and you can take this back to your IT administration team and your global administrators and say, hey, have we set this up, or are we making use of these features as part of this? We've actually published all these links up in this article here. So I'm actually going to go over to one of our tenants here and bring this article up. So you'll be able to hit that URL. In fact, you know what, let me just chat it out to the group so you've got it here as we're going through. People want to multitask and have a look at things, by all means, feel free to do that. So let's start with the identity providers. The article we're going to do a little more tweaking and branding on to make it a little easier to digest. This was something we were hustling together yesterday, today. But basically the left-hand side provide links into your Azure portal, and those links work for whatever identity you signed in. So it's not like they're coming to our Azure Active Directory. If you're signed into your Azure AD and you use those links, you'll go into the appropriate spot in your Azure AD. And the right-hand side takes you into links to articles that we published on the UM website to give some more background and detail around that. So let's start with the identity provider side. So we've already talked about those different types of identity providers that you can bring people in under. So I'm going to go into our dev tenant here and just have a look at how that's configured and set up. Now you can navigate here as well. If you went to Azure AD and then clicked on external identities, you would get to this page here, and I'm in the all identity providers section. Now we haven't set all of these up in this dev tenant. We just have the default ones in here. So when you've got a new tenant, you've always got Azure Active Directory and you've always got Microsoft account in there. And now as a new tenant, you'll always have an email one-time passcode in there. That one will have different options depending on how old your tenant is. Ours, this particular tenant goes back quite a few years, and it just has this feature to turn on or off the one-time passcode for guests. If you're in a newer tenant, actually flip over here, this is a dev tenant that Logan created just before the webinar. This is what it looks like for you, where you've got this option to automatically enable one-time passcode starting July 2022. So that's the date that Microsoft is currently set to say that's when we just want it to light up. Or you can say, you know what, just enable it right now, or I want to disable it for guests. I strongly discourage you from disabling it. It's a strong feature. The fallback, if you don't have one-time passcode, is the guest user that's coming in that doesn't have an organizational account is forced to set up an Azure AD account for themselves with password reset and everything else. It's really confusing for guests to go through, and they tend to drop off and abandon trying to get into your portal as a result of that, which is why Microsoft brought out the one-time passcode here. So I strongly encourage you to say, just leave it set to the effective now and start using the one-time passcode. Other than turning it on, there's nothing you need to configure for it. It's super easy from that perspective. Now, the article links that are in the main article page that I chatted out there talk more about some of the other options like the Google and the Facebook. So those ones do require a little bit more work. So Google was asking for what's called a client ID and client secret. What you have to do is set up an account in Google for your organization, register Microsoft Azure AD as an application, and get back a client ID and secret from Google that you can put into Azure AD. Facebook works the same way. It's how OpenID Connect works in terms of setting up federation through there. So there's a few steps through there. We talk about the high-level steps, and then we refer you to the Microsoft Docs articles that take you into the detail of how you set those up. So Facebook would be the same there. I wouldn't encourage going through the SAML WSFed setup through there. You know, that's something that your IT organization might want to do if you're using something different than Microsoft as your main single sign-on. It wouldn't have anything to do with guests. So it's really the Google and the Facebook that have to do with guests. So that's the external identity side of things. So if we come back to our article here, the next thing is the external collaboration settings. So these are kind of tenant-wide settings around how guests work or whether guests are even allowed in your tenants. If we go ahead and go into that one, it's taking me back into the Azure portal. So actually, if I come back to the slides, Logan grabbed me a screenshot of how this is set up on a brand new tenant. So by default, guest users have limited access to directory objects in your Azure AD. They can't see everything, but they see some access through that, and anybody can invite guests in through there. If I look at how our development tenant is set up, we've made it more restrictive to say guest users can only see their own directory objects. They can't see any profile information of anybody else in the tenant, which is kind of the way that we like it. We have our extranet user manager product that sits on top of Azure AD, and we've got a much richer delegation model that we can then surface some of that information with opt-in and privacy and all those sorts of things. So we prefer to keep the tenant locked down and restricted from this point of view. We also typically don't want anyone inviting guests right through the Azure portal. You know, that's again part of our product is to simplify and delegate the invitation process. So we lock down who's allowed to do the invitations. I'll talk a bit about guest self-service sign-up flows. Again, you know, our portal product has a really rich registration process that doesn't use this, but we've set this tenant up to use the out-of-the-box self-service sign-up, which is part of Azure Active Directory as well. So you can do this yourself with out-of-the-box Azure AD. And then we've left it open that invitations can go to any domain. You can basically have a whitelist or a blacklist. If you say, hey, there's specific domains, maybe I don't want gmail.com users coming in, you could put a deny on gmail.com. Or you could say, you know what, there's just 3 partner organizations that we want to work with, put them on a waitlist, and they're the only ones that you can invite in through there. Okay. So again, these apply across the tenant as a whole. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about Teams or SharePoint or anything else. If you say, hey, you know, you're not allowed to invite guest users in, if you're in Teams and you're owner of the team and you want to invite a guest, this is going to stop you from doing that. So you have to think about not just within Azure, but within the other applications. How do you want to either allow or block people from doing things through there?
Hey Peter, good question from Ali on. It's related to it in certain ways. Basically, there's some web parts in SharePoint Online that doesn't display correctly for guest users, even though they have the same permissions as internal users? Have we experienced that ourselves?
I know there are still spots, not just SharePoint Online, but in general, where guests don't work properly in different parts of 365. It is very much the exception, not the norm. I can't remember specific spots. Sally, if you've got particular web parts that jump out to mind, happy to explore that with you. Now, if you're setting your tenant up to bring guest users in, you do have to understand that if you're using Azure AD B2B, they are going to see a Microsoft login form as part of that experience. But by properly setting up your company branding, which is the next thing that we're going to talk about here, you can actually hide most of that. I mean, if they look carefully in the browser address bar, I'll show you in a minute, they'll still see login.microsoftonline.com, but they should otherwise not see Microsoft anywhere, and they should see all of your company branding as part of that. So let's actually have a look at that. We'll play through a couple of scenarios here. So I'm going to go into a new in private window here. Actually, let me come back for a second. I'm going to grab a SharePoint Online site that I've shared out with an external user. So I'm just going to grab that URL and I plug it into my in private window. So I'm in a brand new browser window. Microsoft doesn't know who I am. I'm going to bring up the Microsoft login form. But you'll see here that it doesn't actually say Microsoft. It says Envision IT up here. And it's got some copy down here saying, hey, you need to use the same username you'd sign into your organization as Microsoft 365. And we can actually put links in here. We could have a link to our own help article or video if we wanted to on here as part of that. And that this may be different than your email address. We'll talk about this later in the talk around some what's called a user principal name versus an email and how they can be different and how that can cause your guests some confusion. But I'm going to go ahead and use my account that I just set up recently for this. And we can see here, I've still got the Envision IT branding. If I look carefully up in my browser bar, yes, I'm on a Microsoft website, but otherwise I'm not really aware of that. I feel like I'm on an Envision IT website. And this is actually the one-time passcode path that I was just talking about. So I've logged in with this email address that doesn't have an organizational account or a Microsoft account. It's going to take me down this path here. So Microsoft just sent me a code. Let me go back to my inbox here for a sec. So you can see there at 12:26 p.m. So just a minute ago from Microsoft, I got this account verification code. So I can just copy that code, come back to my browser session, paste that in, and sign in. And that's all I need to do. So it's super simple for me as a guest user. I didn't need to create a password or remember it or deal with any sort of forgot password processes. I simply get that code, drop it in. As soon as I've used it, as the name implies, it's done. Somebody else can't use it. And if the 30 minutes expire with me not using it, it's also invalid at that point in time from that perspective. So it's actually quite secure from that perspective. And now I'm in this SharePoint Online site as that pcarson at umdemo.co. So how did I do that branding? What was involved in setting that up? If we come back here, we click on the company branding link, that'll take me back into the Azure portal, and we can see how that's configured. So all these various different pages that I'm showing you are all in the Azure AD section of the Azure portal. There's a lot of stuff in there. That's why we find that link page handy, kind of guides you into the appropriate spots through there. So you can actually make it multilingual. We've only set up English on this one here, but it uses the language of the browser of the person that's coming in to decide which branding to show to that person. So in Canada, bilingual is quite common. We could have an English and a French version of that. Let's have a look at that branding. Now we haven't filled in all of the different things here. We didn't put a background image on this one. We do have our banner logo. It looks kind of weird with the black because it's a transparent PNG. Just works better on the pages from that point of view. And that sign-in page text that I was showing you before, explaining how you would sign in. And you can see here, there's a particular format you need to follow to put a hyperlink into this text. It's not, standard HTML. It's got the square brackets and the round brackets, but that's how you can put your own links in there. They don't have to go to a Microsoft proper. They could go to your own portal page or help page or however you want to configure that from that point of view. And you can provide background colors and logos that you used in different spots through Azure AD. In fact, if I flip over to another tenant here for a second, so let's go over to our demo tenant, and I'll do the same thing. I'll do an in private window here, and I'll go to our Extranet User Manager portal. So this is our product, but it uses Azure AD to authenticate. So I'm not at this point going into Microsoft 365, but I can still use it from a sign-in perspective. And I'm going to use an account that already exists so we don't go through the registration flow. I just want to get right to, whoops. All right. Right to the Microsoft login. So you can see this one, we have put a background image on, we've put a different logo in, we've got different text in here, and links and such through there. So you can see it's the same login.microsoftonline.com, but it tailors and switches depending on what property you're going to and what branding has been associated with that property. Okay, so let's come back here. Conditional access policy. So this is a biggie. This is where you set up all of your security. So let's start diving into this side. So there's an article that I wrote a couple months ago that talks about conditional access policies and best practices for your organization. They apply not just for guests, they actually apply more importantly for your regular staff and your administrators. We talk about three groups: administrators, regular staff, and guests. You should have policies for each of those defined through here. So we've defined an admin and a user meaning members or staff, and then we've got a guest policy in here as well. We've also got a policy that blocks legacy protocols. That's like old versions of Office and Outlook and things like that. It's a huge security hole that you want to close through conditional access policies. So this is one of the biggest reasons for getting Azure AD P1 for your staff, is to be able to set these policies up and to work with your IT department or your managed services provider to make sure these are configured properly and things are secure. You have to be a little bit careful. There's things like emergency accounts that you set up so that if you mess your rules up, you don't block all of your administrators out of your tenant and then you can't fix things. So there's some care involved in setting these up. But basically, if I look at the require MFA for users, this is a typical rule that you would set up for your staff, and it's saying, hey, this is going to be for all users, but I'm going to exclude guests and external users. So I don't want this particular rule to apply to my guests. This is just for my staff. And basically, if any of my staff are coming in for all cloud apps, so everything that they're doing, I have a condition in here that says, hey, which apps are we applying this to? Well, browser and client apps, the legacy ones are already blocked through that other policy. And I'm going to require multi-factor authentication. This is super important. Passwords alone are not enough these days to secure accounts. Every single user account in your tenant should require multi-factor authentication. If somebody says, hey, I can't because of this or that, you got to fix this or that, and it needs to become a blanket thing across your organization. Now, this one is excluded the guests, and sometimes organizations go too far the other way and they say, hey, I want MFA for all of my guests. Well, if your guest is coming in to read some product documentation or maybe take a course on how to use your product, do you really need MFA on that? Probably not. You need to think about the sensitivity of the content and whether it actually requires MFA. Because if a guest requires MFA, they're going to have to set up, their SMS or their authenticator app, and there's a bunch of stuff they need to do. And again, you're going to confuse them and cause support issues and have people abandon and give up trying to come into your portal. So you have to be judicious about how you enforce the MFA or not through there. So if I come back to my conditional access rules here, you'll see there's one there for guests accessing sensitive content. So this is getting a little more complicated here. What it's doing is saying, okay, now the specific users that we're going to include is all guests and external users. So this policy is just for our guests. But it has what's called an authentication context on here. And basically what we've done is we've set up a policy in the Compliance Center in Microsoft that says, hey, if content is tagged as called sensitive, then this rule applies to it. We're working with a client in the States where they've got hundreds and hundreds of SharePoint sites, and the vast majority of those they don't need MFA on. But there's about 5 or 6 sites that are for collaboration with the federal US government for the Department of Energy, and that stuff has sensitive content in them, and they want to enforce MFA on that. So we're using these policies to drive that, to say those SharePoint sites have a label on them that says they're sensitive, and if somebody tries to access that content, it will trigger and force an MFA as part of that. So if we look at the controls on here, you can see that it requires MFA. It only triggers if they're hitting that sensitive content. And we've actually made this a fairly frequent one to say, hey, you've got to reauthenticate every hour on this. You probably wouldn't set it up for real this way, but you can decide what sort of sign-in frequency and controls you want to have around that. So if I come back to my in private window, so remember I signed into this SharePoint site, and it's a regular SharePoint site, didn't have a sensitive label on it, so just let me in easily through there. Let's come back to my dev tenant here, and I've got another SharePoint site here that actually has a sensitive label on it. So you can see here right at the top, it says sensitive SharePoint content. We've defined the label and we've applied it to this site. So it's going to trigger that rule. So if I take this URL here, drop it over into my in private window where I'm already signed in, and I hit that site, SharePoint's smart enough to say, wait a minute, this has a conditional access policy that's forcing multi-factor authentication. I needed to take you back to the login because you didn't go through MFA the last time. And this is what a user would experience going through. I haven't actually set up MFA for this account. So the first time they log in, they're going to have to decide how they want to configure their MFA. Are they going to get a phone? Are they going to use the mobile app? Scan the QR code, go through all those steps. So there's a fair bit more involved in doing this. Now there's another part of Azure AD related to this called trust settings. So let's come back here for a sec. So under our cross-tenant settings, you can trust certain tenants. So in that example I was talking about, where it's the US Federal Department of Energy, odds are they use MFA on their side already. And if you trust them as an organization to say, yeah, I feel they do their security job properly, you can actually trust their MFA as part of it, and then the person doesn't need to go through that setup. So here in this cross-tenant access settings, we set one up for Envision IT. So I'm in the Envision IT dev tenant, and I'm saying, hey, set up a trust to our main production Envision IT tenant. So I can actually look at the rules for that. So this is quite granular. You can say, hey, what are people allowed to do from a B2B collaboration point of view? You can make that organization by organization. The direct connect is what you use for shared channels and teams. I think that'll be a whole nother topic to talk about, but it's this trust settings here that I want to come to. So you can say, rather than the default settings that don't trust the other organization, for this particular organization, trust their MFA and trust their compliant devices and Azure AD joined devices, so that you can use all those rules in your conditional access policies, and they won't have to set up MFA again on their side. So I've done this for Envision IT. So if I come to my main production tenant that I'm signed into here, and I try to go to that sensitive site, so you'll see, actually it flipped too quick, but oh, there it goes. It went to login.microsoftonline.com. So it flipped over to say, hey, I need to get a token, make sure this person is valid and signed in. But then it took me right into the sensitive site, and it didn't go through an MFA as part of that. And the reason for that is that our production tenant has policies that enforce MFA on all of our user accounts. So I'd already gone through an MFA to sign into my organization. When I come to this guest tenant, it says, hey, trust Envision IT's security. Yes, they've got the MFA. It was done for this person signing in for this session. You're good to go, and you can come into this sensitive content. So when you've got deeper connections with particular organizations, and you're dealing with higher security information or personal health information, financial information, you want to add that level of security to it, you can do it. And if the other organization has set up their security properly, they don't have to go through a second MFA as part of that. A lot less confusing for people. This stuff is all preview. It just lit up in the last couple of months in Azure AD, but it's really valuable from a, it's always that balance between security and usability. And this strikes a really nice balance from that point of view. Okay, so we've gone through those sections there. Terms of use, this is another important thing to think about. So maybe you've got a terms of use that you need all of your guests to sign off on before they start accessing your resources. Non-disclosure, confidentiality, things like that. You can define your own policies and make them part of the login process. So actually in this tenant here, our dev tenant, we don't have this set up. So let me flip this over to our demo tenant where I know we do have it set up. So here we have our demo terms of use. So basically what you do when you're creating a terms of use, you're defining a bunch of rules about, do they have to expand the full terms of use? Do they have to consent on every device that they sign in on? Do those consents expire? Is it fine to accept it once and it lasts forever? Or do you say every 90 days or once a year, they have to go through that terms of use and how many people have accepted that and such? And just like the branding, you can have different languages. So if you want an English and a French terms of use, you can absolutely do that as part of that. And the way this wires in is back into the conditional access policy. So if I come back to conditional access, sorry, where did my policies go? Oh, there we go. I actually have a conditional access policy called terms of use. And maybe you don't want your staff to go through this because maybe that's already covered with your employment agreements. That's fine. So we've scoped this rule down just to apply to guests and external users, kind of like that sensitive one that we were just looking at previously. And then from a control point of view, when you define a terms of use, it actually shows up as an option to select in your terms of use or in your conditional access policy. So you can grant access, but they have to accept that terms of use before they get in. If they abandon, don't accept it, the login fails and they're not allowed into your resources until they accept those terms as part of that. So that's how you set up the terms of use. So, that's something that we would see in most client settings as part of that. Now, the last pieces here, I'm going to go fairly light on through here. There's what's called access reviews. And this is setting up policies to say, hey, on a regular basis, somebody needs to review users or group membership or things like that to say, are these still the right people in here? And it's all to do with your governance policy around your external users. So you can create these rules to say, hey, I want a particular access review that forces the owner of the team to review all the members of the team and make sure they should still be in there and say that this needs to be done on a monthly or a quarterly basis and such from there. So you can get fairly sophisticated in terms of defining these rules out through there. I'm going to show you a different approach that we're going to be open sourcing out as part of this. This does require Azure AD B2B. What I'm going to talk about doesn't require that, and I actually find it a more beneficial and useful way of doing that. So that's about as far as I'll go into that side of it. On the monitoring side, yeah, there's a ton of activity logs, sign-in logs that you can see through the Azure portal in here. And again, the piece I'm about to show you is just a better way to surface that information up as well. You still need the licensing in place to be able to collect all that information, but it's about leveraging Power BI to better visualize what's coming out from that. I can see all of the login activity through here. I can start adding in filters to look for particular scenarios, but this is a little overwhelming. There's too much detail in here as part of that. So let me flip back to the deck. Before I get into the Harvester tool that I was going to talk about, let's just do a quick recap from a best practices point of view and guess. So I said quite a few times already, I feel it's important that you have Azure AD P1 for all of your members. I don't get commission from Microsoft for that. It is a cost associated with it. It's just a really good idea from that point of view. And even if you're not going to do it for all of your members, get one license and light it up for your external users, because most organizations I talk to don't have more than 50,000 monthly active users. If you don't have the one-time passcode turned on in your tenant, turn it on. There's no downside. It makes life a lot easier for your guest users that don't have organizational accounts. So I'd strongly encourage you to use that. The company branding is pretty easy to set up. Yeah, you do need to be a global administrator to do it, but do that, and then people aren't wondering why they're seeing Microsoft when they're coming to your portal. They see your company branding as part of that. And talk to legal, understand, do we have a standard terms of use that should be enforced? Let's get that set up. Set up the logging and auditing. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And look at the sensitivity of content. Don't do a knee-jerk, oh, we should have MFA for all of our guests. You probably don't want that, but maybe some of it you do. So understand what the sensitivity is of the different content that you have and where you should apply multi-factor authentication requirements to that, and say, hey, we need more than a password. We need that second factor of authentication. And that's where the conditional access policies come in, which is why you need at least that one P1 license for that. And then if you are requiring MFA for certain things, is that for key partners? Do they already have their own MFA set up in their Azure AD? And if so, can you set up the trust settings so that they don't have to do it again in your tenant? It's going to make life a lot easier for your guests coming in. Okay, so let's come over to our Azure AD Harvester tool. It's actually not a permissions tool. I meant to fix the typo on that. It's basically collecting analytics and log activity from your Azure AD and presenting it up in a Power BI dashboard. So, from a solution architecture point of view, we've got this console app that you can either run at the command line. I'll show you quickly how that works, or you can actually set it up as a scheduled service in your tenant and have it run maybe on a nightly basis and refresh the Power BI from there. And basically it's pulling some data out of Azure AD and putting into a storage account in your Azure. We're not collecting any of the information. We're not hanging on to anything. This is all on your side, and you own and manage all the content related to this. And there's also some diagnostic settings that you set up to capture log analytics into a storage account, so the Power BI can use all of that and present that up. So let's start with having a look at the Power BI view of that. So if I come over here, we actually expose it in our Extranet User Manager tool, but you can run it in the Power BI service as a standard Power BI. So the idea is you don't need our product to use any of this stuff, but it is integrated in with it as well. I'll just give our dev site a minute to fire up here. There we go. So if I come into the report section here, we're using Power BI embedded, so we don't need a Power BI license for everybody that's coming in to view this report. And I can click on admin here and we'll actually see that report. I actually needed to do that step first because it's starting up the service. We don't leave it running all the time because we don't want to pay Microsoft for that embedded service 724 when we're not using it. So we'll let that get fired up and going. It takes a few seconds to start up and then initialize the report from there. And actually, I have the Power BI service open in another tab here. I should be able to refresh that and see that as well. So the way I'm running this report right now, it's still just coming up in Power BI. Here we go. Is it's filtered down just to look for Azure AD groups that have been defined as Extranet User Manager groups. So it's not everything in the tenant, but you can leave this wide open and have it gather everything in the tenant if you choose to. So it's basically on this page here, it's going to show me what groups I have, what users I have, and some details around that. Not sure why Power BI is deciding to be so slow for me this afternoon. Usually comes up a little snappier than this. No, that's not working. Huh. Okay, let me try that one more time. I don't think the service started properly for me. Problem with using a development tenant. There we go. These things don't always work as they're supposed to. Logan, do we have a current version that's running in demo? Should I go over there and give that a whirl?
We don't have it in demo. I was using this about an hour ago, Peter. So
was I in my dry run. It worked fine. There we go. It is starting to populate.
There you go.
Just going to give me grief here. Okay, so like I mentioned, it's not showing me all groups in the tenant. It's just showing me the 24 that are extra user manager groups. But we can run this wider open and say, hey, gather everything as part of that. And this particular dev tenant has 77 users in it. So we can show me some high level details around, you know, the types of groups, how much are mail enabled Microsoft 365 groups versus not. From a group type point of view, is it a unified group or not? You know, how many members are in each group? So it's my most popular one. It's actually called Jeff Test Group 5. Very creative name on that. What type of users do we have in here? So we've got 70 guests, we've got 6 members, we've got 1 blank user. That's actually one that we need to look at from a tenant issue perspective. That's one of the common issues that I'm going to talk about in a second. You know, are groups private or public, or do they not define that? And from a user point of view, we put users into buckets to say, hey, you know, when was their last login? You know, 0 to 7 days ago, 11 people logged in. 8 to 14 days, we've got 9 more, out to 136 users that have never actually logged in. And that's another governance issue to look at, is to say, hey, if I invited people in that just aren't coming in, do they need access? Should they still have access? Should I remove that? You know, there's no hard and fast rule around that, but that's something you need to decide from a governance perspective. And here I can see users and number of groups that they belong to. So I get sort of a high level picture of what's happening between guests and members in my tenant through this page here. If I'm supporting these users, I might look at the sign-in failures to say, hey, what sort of problems are people having signing into the portal? So we can see here the histogram that shows, you know, numbers of sign-ins over time and how many of those were failures and what was the percentage of failures across that. So we had 3% failures. You know, we can see where those sign-ins were happening. Maybe I just want to look at guest members, guest accounts, not member accounts. Everything else changes because Power BI is very interactive. I can see how that breaks down. Or maybe people are having more problems on Edge. So let's look at Edge as a browser. You know, and what sort of errors were we seeing as part of that? You know, this error occurred due to the keep me signed in interrupt. So it was part of the sign in process, went wrong through there. So you can start to use this to say, hey, you know, there's obvious ones like invalid username or password. They need to type in the right credentials to be able to get in through there. They didn't pass the MFA challenge. That was probably me, as we were seeing there, you know, where I started to go through the sign in, got to the MFA challenge and abandoned my sign in. So that would be a failure from that perspective as well. So it gives you a lot of insight in terms of what's happening in your tenant. And if you filter it down to the guests, you can get it at that level as well. I mean, you can see the broader across all sign-ins. So we can see here, you know, what portion of our sign-ins were unsuccessful versus successful. What's the you know, the ratio between those in a percentage from that point of view. And again, you know, where were those, what browsers, what people and such from that. So a ton of information here. It's all there in the Azure portal. It's just hard to surface up. It's, you know, it's hard to visualize that straight through the Azure portal. And actually, if I come back here, yeah, so it's working in the Power BI service as well. So you don't need to run it in our product. You can deploy it into your Power BI service. You do need a Power BI license to use that. You could run the report just in Power BI desktop, which you can download for free on your local machine and have a look at this data and not need to buy any Power BI services for that. So ton of information there. We're pretty excited about this. And as I mentioned, we're going to be publishing this up onto GitHub next week. And we do have an article that talks about this, and there'll be a download link available in there for next Wednesday to be able to pull that down. So if we come back here, we do have some things from a common B2B issues point of view. So this user type, so if you remember back, I had guest accounts and member accounts and then blank. You should never see blank, but if you've got accounts that were created, you know, 10 plus years ago before there were guest accounts in Azure AD, they may still not have the type filled in on them. It's really easy to fix. You just identify those users, go into the tenant or into the Azure portal and set them to be a member or a guest. Typically, they would be a member account and clean that up so that you can get proper reporting coming out, because you typically want to filter on guest versus member. This mismatch between email and UPN. UPN stands for user principal name. This was that note that we put into the sign-in to say, use the username that you sign into your Microsoft 365. Because some organizations, often for security reasons, will say your sign-in address is different than your email address. So if somebody knows your email address, they can't guess your sign-in address and try and impersonate you through there. The problem is when you invite somebody by their email, when they get to the Microsoft login, they can't enter their email address. They actually need to enter their username or their user principal name in order to successfully log in. It's the same thing they have to do when they're going to their own Microsoft 365, but it still causes confusion for some people as part of that. Sometimes email is not even filled in on an Azure AD account, in which case, if you try and invite that person in, it's just not going to work properly. So sometimes there's cleanup that needs to be done in your guest organization's tenants. It's not something you can do. You need them to fix up on their side. Unaccepted invitations. This was a big issue for one of our recent launches where they had a bunch of invitations that had gone out quite a few years ago. And kind of if you were more than about a year and a half back, you'd invited somebody, they had to use a special link that was in the email that came from Microsoft to accept that invitation. If they didn't do that, they would never be able to log in as a guest. And the problem is, if you've invited them 5 years ago, they're never going to find that email. They're never going to be able to sign in. And even if you invite them again, because they have that unaccepted invitation from years ago, they're still going to be blocked from signing in. So there's actually a preview feature that you can basically reset all those invitations. Nothing goes out to the guest users. They don't need that invitation email anymore, and everything works smoothly. So this is another article we've got kind of half-baked. We do need to finish it up and publish it up. It's just a little bit of PowerShell you run on your tenant, and it clears that issue up. Conflicting Microsoft account. You can't do this anymore, but in the past, I have one myself. Peter@envisionit.com is my personal Microsoft account, and it conflicts with my Microsoft 365 email account. So when I sign in as a guest, I often get are you signing in with your work or your personal credentials? And some things in Microsoft, back to Ali's question earlier, don't work properly. And this is one of the things that sometimes breaks is even though you pick the right thing, it still doesn't let you in properly. So ideally, you don't want to have those conflicting accounts. Unfortunately, you can't control it for the external users, which is why Microsoft blocked this and said you can't do that anymore. You can just create Outlook.com and Hotmail accounts. You can't create it on your own email domain anymore. But lots of those exist out there. You just need to be aware of it. And then from a guest governance point of view, I didn't get a chance to put some notes in here, but thinking about users not in any groups, users have never signed in, or they haven't signed in X number of days. I mean, we're basically surfacing some of that up in here. So if I go to this user issues tab, I can see that we've got however many 112 users that don't belong to any groups. Now that could be valid. This is looking at Azure AD groups. Maybe those users belong to a SharePoint group that are not Azure AD, and they do have access to something in SharePoint, and there's a reason for them to be there. So it's hard to judge. It depends on your policies in your organization whether that user should be removed from the system. Are they missing an email? Did they never accept the invitation? Are some of the other key things in there? We're going to add in some more rules like hasn't logged in X number of days and things like that to build that out. What we'd like to do is make this actionable to say, hey, I can pick all of those users there, click a link, get into our Extranet User Manager product, bring those users up and decide delete, or whatever the case may be. It still needs to be a manual decision, but make it easy for people to discover what those issues are and then address and resolve them. So I think I don't have time to go through the demo. Basically, it's a command line program that you run. You sign into it with your Azure AD credentials. It pulls that information out and it puts it in a storage account that you need to configure ahead of time. You can then point the Power BI at and get your own report for your own tenant through there. You need some elevated rights to be able to run that. So if you're not an administrator, you'll probably need to direct your administrator to do that for you, but it gives you a ton of valuable information. So just key takeaways from here. If we go back about a dozen slides or so, I had 10 or 12 guest management best practices. Review that, think about that in the context of your organization. Say, okay, which ones are we doing? Which ones aren't we? How do we address that? Think about the common issues that I just talked about. How do we look for that? Using the harvester is a great way to identify those and find those so you can fix them. and define your guest governance plan. You know, is it an invite and they can be there forever, or do we need some sort of life cycle management around our guests and such? Like I mentioned, we've been publishing up a ton of articles, so there's lots of links in here. You can go to our website and get those through there. We also have a lot of past webinar sessions that talk to a lot of the different points that I've made through here over the last year or so. So by all means, have a look at those as well. We're going to take a little pause over the summer for July and August from live webinars. We may do some pre-recorded ones, more product focus, but stay tuned. We're going to have some more upcoming events in the fall coming from there. So Logan, I'm not sure, in the 60 seconds we have left, whether there's some open questions we want to tackle, or we'll just circle back from there.
There's one question from Rosanna. Does B2B help with sharing Outlook calendars with external users to check availability?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure. Like, I know you can define who can see your calendar. Can that person be a guest user? Something to try out.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have guests set up in your tenant, you could give it a whirl. You could invite your personal email address as a guest to experiment with it and see how that goes. Let us know what the results